Recording in progress.
Buddy, thank you so much for joining us today on the second Kansas Forest Service Book Club. My name is Ariel Whiteley Knoll. I'm the communications coordinator for the Kansas Forest Service. Really glad to have you all on with us this afternoon. Today, we are going to be discussing Doug Tallamy's book. I'm sorry, that was our last one. We're going to be discussing George Fraser's book, The Last Wild Places of Kansas. If you haven't read Doug Tallamy's book, you should go back and read it. That one was really good too. We are recording today's presentation, so please make sure to stay muted unless you're joining in on the discussion. We will start our discussion today with a short presentation by our Northeast Rural Forester, EJ Jamison. Really excited to have her on. And then after EJ's presentation, we'll go ahead and dive into discussing the book a little bit more. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to EJ.
Awesome. Thank you all for joining, and thank you, Ariel, for facilitating and organizing. I will share my screen real quick here. Okay. Ariel, can you confirm that you're seeing that in full screen with no of the Zoom dialogues in there?
Looks good. No notes or anything.
Perfect. Okay. So yes, as Ariel said, I am EJ Jamison. I am the Northeast District Forester, and today we're talking about The Last Wild Places of Kansas by George Fraser. And I'll be talking a bit about how this book plays into some of the work we do here at Kansas Forest Service. So just for a quick overview, I'll start with a bit of background about myself, and then I'll talk a bit about different ecotypes in Kansas. And then I'll pose the question of why we manage wild spaces in Kansas. And because I'm a forester, I have to talk about why we manage forests in Kansas. And lastly, I'll leave you with some tips for exploring. So I grew up in upstate New York, and I spent a lot of time exploring the Adirondack Mountains here in this bottom center photo. And that was where I kind of realized that I wanted to be in the environmental field, and I wanted to be spending my time outside in the woods. So I got my undergraduate degree at the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry, and then my master's from the University of Vermont. And shortly after that, I moved to Lawrence, Kansas with my husband. And not too long after that, I was working for Kansas Forest Service. And I started as the district forester back in June of last year. But I was so excited to talk about The Last Wild Places of Kansas because this book was really a wonderful guide for me when I first moved to Kansas. Being from the Northeast and in Vermont in particular, I was just used to having a ton of publicly accessible land around. And it was a bit of an adjustment moving to Kansas and recognizing that we have 98% of our land here privately owned. So I was kind of struggling with that, but my husband went out to the Raven bookstore in Lawrence, shout out to your local public bookstores or bookstores, and came home with The Last Wild Places of Kansas. And I read it and I loved it. And it got me really excited about exploring wild places in Kansas, and it shifted my perspective on my relationship to wild places. So let's see here. To kick off the talk, I wanted to, get into a bit of the different ecoregions in Kansas that George Fraser really explores in this book. So one of the reasons we have all of these distinct, unique wild places in Kansas is because we are literally at the geographic center of the country, which is right here in Lebanon, Kansas, which is in Smith County. And that means that, smack in the center of the country, we are actually an ecotone, this whole state is. So we are the place where central hardwood forests are transitioning into the grasslands in the Great Plains. So we are the westernmost extent of the central hardwood forests, the easternmost extent of the Great Plains grasslands, and then the northernmost extent of some of these more southern ecoregions like the southwestern tablelands and the cross timbers and the Ozarks. So we have a lot of really interesting places colliding in our state. And George Fraser gets out to a lot of these. He looks at otters and old growth over here in the central irregular plains, hikes the largest remnant tallgrass prairie in the Flint Hills, meets some old growth post oak and the cross timbers, gets on some streams in the Ozarks, and then goes out to the Central Great Plains for the black ferret reintroductions or black-footed ferret reintroductions, talks about our megafauna in the high plains, and then even gets down to the tablelands for the gypsum hills and the red hills. So he does a pretty good job at getting to most of these ecoregions. So I wanted to center this talk around this question, which is why manage our wild places in Kansas? And I wanted to do that not only because that's what I do for a living, but because I guess the first answer to this question is something that is pretty universal across all Kansas ecosystems, both prairie and woodland. So many people are aware that prairies need some sort of disturbance, usually fire, to promote native species and knock back woody encroachment. But less people know that our woodlands here in Kansas are also disturbance adapted. So here is a photo of a pretty high quality oak hickory forest here on the right. And our oaks and hickories, which are really the iconic species of central hardwoods, they are relatively shade intolerant trees. So that means that they need open canopies and they need sunlight actually hitting the forest floor to regenerate themselves. If forests become more dense and the canopies start to close, sunlight's not hitting that forest floor and these trees are not going to be able to regenerate themselves. So we're actually losing a lot of these oak hickory forests as they transition to forests dominated by more shade tolerant trees like hackberry, green ash, and American elm. So posing that question, why manage our wild spaces in Kansas? It's because they are fire adapted ecosystems, disturbance adapted ecosystems. So you should probably already know this if you're living in Kansas, but if you read a single page in this book, you will know that Native Americans are the original stewards of the land in Kansas, and tribes were intentionally setting fires to promote bison habitat and also to promote more desired plant species. So this map I'm showing here is from Native Land Digital, and they are an Indigenous-led nonprofit based in Canada, and they are mapping Indigenous territories, treaties, and languages across the world. But this cutout here is showing what is present-day Kansas. So there are 8 Native American tribes that are native to present-day Kansas: the Arapaho, Cheyenne, Comanche, Kanza, Kiowa, Osage, Pawnee, and Wichita. And then in addition to that, there were 18 Native American tribes that were forcibly relocated to Kansas. So the genocide of Indigenous peoples and the bison in and of itself is a huge tragedy, but one of the consequences was also a big reduction in the amount of fire that was being applied to our landscape, and we are still seeing the negative impacts of that fire removal. So back to my question, why manage our wild places in Kansas? The second answer there is that humans have been doing this for thousands of years, and it is a very important part of our landscape. So I really appreciated the emphasis on Native American history that Fraser included in the last Wild Places of Kansas. Okay, so because I'm a forester and this is the Kansas Forest Service Book Club, I reserve the right for the next chunk of this presentation to be about forests specifically. Hope that's cool with you. But there are many important benefits of forest management in Kansas, and as foresters, we are prescribing different management practices to achieve a variety of different objectives. The number one objective that landowners come to me for are promoting wildlife habitat. And so I have a photo of a quail here, and you're probably thinking, silly EJ, quails are grassland birds. What are they doing here about forests? But quail and a lot of other wildlife species really need that shrubby edge habitat and that transition zone between forests and grasslands. So wildlife do not like 90 degrees from timber to grasslands. They like timber, smaller trees, shrubs, tall grasses down to your grasslands. So that shrubby transition zone is really important for a wildlife species, for many wildlife species. And we are including that as a lot of our forest management plans. Another thing forest management can do is generate deadwood, which, as Fraser mentions in the book, is really important for wildlife and old growth forests. And things like woodpeckers are going to be really appreciating that deadwood in the forest. Also, from a wildlife perspective, promoting our oaks and hickories, that's going to be really important because they're putting out those seeds, which wildlife really need as a food source. So yet another way to support our wildlife with forest management there. Next up, oftentimes we're managing forests for improved forest health. This photo here is a photo of exit holes from emerald ash borer. If you're not familiar with that invasive insect, it is causing a pretty serious decline in ash across the whole country, or well, it's making its way across the whole country, I should say. This photo here, just below that, is of bush honeysuckle. I'm sure you've seen that around, but if you want any plants to be regenerating in the forest, you have to be removing bush honeysuckle. It is super aggressive, shades everything out, and can pretty quickly lead to just a monoculture of honeysuckle you can't even really walk through. Next up, manage forests for biodiversity. So we're removing oftentimes a lot of less desirable vegetation, eastern red cedar or invasive honeysuckle, but also shade tolerant trees that are competing with our more desirable trees from a wildlife or a potential timber value perspective. So opening up those canopies, again, letting more sunlight in and promote the regeneration of understory vegetation. And lastly, we manage our forests to restore a function that may have been lost. So that photo there is of a stream bank stabilization project along the Cottonwood River. That's headed up by Andy Klein, who is our water quality forester. And there they are planting native vegetation, both trees and grasses and forbs, to hold on to that soil there, slow down the river, and hopefully prevent, at least quickly, soil erosion from the river. So we are applying forest management specifically to reach one or more of those objectives. And so I wanted to talk a bit about the forest management process overall. So the first phase is always starting with an assessment and looking really closely at the existing conditions, because we're always working within those site restrictions. So we're looking at tree species, understory species, tree regeneration, wildlife using the woodland, soil quality. All of those things are factoring into that initial assessment. Then we're taking all of that data in a phase 2, which is plan development. We're sitting down with the landowner, talking specifically about their objectives. What do they want their woodland to be like in 10, 20, 30 years? And based on all that information, we are prescribing specific forest management practices. So we call that silviculture, which is probably my favorite word. It is defined as the combination of both science and art in order to grow trees. So putting that plan together using objectives and specific practices. And then lastly, phase 3, which is monitoring, really important to make sure that the forest management practices we prescribed are having the desired outcome. So we do some of that, but it's also really important for landowners to get out there and taking an active role in monitoring their woodlands. Okay, so when done correctly, this whole process can really help to support our native plants and wildlife in Kansas. So this is just a few photos of some of these projects that I've been involved with in Northeast Kansas. Like I said, we're often removing things like cedar, opening up that canopy, and thinning out the woodlands to support the more desirable tree species from a wildlife or timber perspective. So again, if we take a step back and think about, what makes a place wild, George Fraser in his Alpha and Omega chapter, he says that wild places become more wild when you reintroduce wild species to them, when they have those thriving communities of wild plants and animals. So I guess my last answer, and probably most philosophic answer to this question, why manage our wild spaces in Kansas, would be to actually make them wilder. So I kind of wanted to close out with just some photos from some wild spaces mentioned in the book that I've been really excited to check out. Prairie chicken booming, spring ephemerals, and Lexington Lake. You should definitely get there if you haven't. And Fraser also mentions, the importance of really wonderful stewardship on private properties. So this photo in the upper right is from a family friend's property in Chanute, Kansas. I've gotten to see Mead's milkweed, check out Baldwin Woods. The salamanders are out at Baker Wetlands. This is a smallmouth salamander there, so you should definitely get out to see those. And of course, beaver, one of our main ecosystem engineers in Kansas. Okay, I also need to highlight some of the wild places that Kansas Forest Service is involved with. The first one, of course, being the Fort Leavenworth pecan tree. So this is one of the pecan trees that Fraser hikes out to on that chapter on old growth. And so this is part of our Champion Tree program. If you're not familiar with that, you should definitely check out our website. But it is a program that maps and describes the largest trees in each county in Kansas. In the book, Fraser has the 2009 height at 120 feet. We have an update, 2017. The tree was measured at 139 feet with the crowd spread of 122 feet, a circumference of 17 feet and 4 inches. So that is a pretty big tree. Next up, Baldwin Woods Forest Preserve. So this is a really special property that was named a National Natural Landmark in 1980 and is part of the U.S. Forest Service Forest Legacy Program, which is administered by Kansas Forest Service here in Kansas. So KU Field Station hosts, I think, 2 public walks every year. I know it's super popular, so there's actually a waiting list, but you should check out their website and sign up for notifications about that, because it is a really wonderful old growth forest to check out here in Kansas. Okay, last up, just want to share some tips for exploring wild places. The first one is to learn from people and the land, but field guides and apps are also really helpful. One way to do this that I really like to do is to get involved with different organizations. Kansas Native Plant Society, Kansas Land Trust, KU Field Station, and many others are often hosting public walks, oftentimes on private property. So that can be a good way to get in on some sites you might not be able to otherwise. Other tips, make sure you bring friends or let someone know where you are. Follow the site rules, check to see if dogs are allowed, and wear orange. Don't be like George Fraser in that regard. And always, always, always get permission to access private property. Lastly, potentially most importantly, dress and check for ticks, please. Okay, so thank you all for tuning in today. I'm excited to talk about this book, and feel free to reach out. My contact information is there if you're interested in talking about woodlands or forest management. Thank you.
That is awesome. Thank you so much, EJ. Super appreciate it. As
bet.
we transition into discussing the book, if people who want to join in want to turn their cameras on, I think that makes it feel less weird in Zoom land. Before I start asking questions about the book, does anybody have questions for EJ? And you can hold them to the end if you want to, but while it's fresh on your mind, we'll wait to see if I see any unmuting.
Hi, EJ.
Mark.
Yes,
Yes.
hi, EJ. Mark Clark here. I'm a landscape photographer. Being from Kansas, I take pictures of a lot of, Flint Hills and a lot of things without trees, but I recently moved further up into Northeast Kansas, now in Topeka, and I'd like to start taking more woodland photographs. And I ventured out to a number of them in this area. And of course, with the lakes we have up here, there's some nice lakes and Blackjack Battlefield, etc. But are there some better resources where I might find locations of some of the old growth forests, or kind of any kind of forest that I might explore and then be able to share those images with others? My intent really is to just kind of push the conservation side of the house. Yeah, that's my question.
Great. Always love to see photos of Kansas woodlands out there. The first resource that comes to mind would be the Discover Kansas Forests page that Ariel just linked up to right on cue. So that is on our website, and we have a list of different wild spaces you can get into in Kansas, and a lot of those are woodlands. One specific recommendation might be, kind of a drive from you but not too far, would be the KU Field Station. And they have some really nice woodlands that are publicly accessible, and some really nice prairie too. So that might be a good place to start.
All right, thanks very much.
You bet.
Well, it seems like we might have a shy group, so I'm going to start you guys out with a real softball question. I am a native Kansan. I've lived here my whole life. I never go anywhere except for Kansas. And this book surprised me. I learned so many things I didn't know about Kansas. And so for those of you that maybe have lived here for a long time or that are new to the state, did this book surprise you about Kansas? Because I feel like we get a bad rap for being kind of boring.
Ariel, I'll speak to that just briefly.
Excellent.
For people, my name is Jeremy Gill. I'm a the Kansas Room coordinator at the Hayes Public Library in Hayes, Kansas. But I also grew up in Garden City, until I moved here about 10 years ago to go to school. I think I've read George's book twice before, I've read it twice. And the part that always gets me, because George is obviously from Lawrence, and the upper northeast corner is much, Kansas has, like, I feel like so many different, and EJ talked to that, is like so many different little microclimates. And like, if you're in Atchison and then you go to like Hugoton, you feel like you're in like two different planets. I mean, we have like so many different things. But what I really liked was that, right in my own Southwest Kansas backyard was the grasslands, the national grasslands. So I really liked that he went out there and, explored some of those places and didn't just keep the book just up in his neck of the woods, which would have been a lot easier for him to do just because, it's kind of accessible for him. So.
That's awesome. I did wonder how he traveled and worked and had a child and like all these places he was going. I think it took place over a while, but
yeah, I think he wrote the book like over like 6 years or something like that. So it was, I think, piecemealed as he went.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've traveled to a lot of the places that he mentions. Not all. They're on the list. One of the most remote and unknown places is the Rickery Breaks up in the very far northeast, northwest part of the state, rather. I have asked people that live in that county or counties surrounding it, and they're not really sure that it exists or they've heard of it. And so it's really one of the most unique places, especially for Kansas. Unfortunately, it is almost all private land. Well, sorry, it is all private land. You have to know somebody, and luckily I do. So I've been able to get out there, but that's one of the biggest problems with exploring parts of Kansas. The Flint Hills is essentially all private land or, under conservation. There are some open range roads down in the southern part of the state that you can take advantage of. You have to remember that you're on public roads, but kind of in private space. But anyway, so I appreciate his perseverance in finding these places and really exploring them. Like Jeremy said, you can travel from one corner of the state to the other, and it will quite literally feel like another planet. So yeah, good observation.
I have a question. My name's Dan Johnson from Kansas City. When I had read the book, it talked about the pecan trees, I think in the Cross Timbers area, as being some of the oldest west of the Mississippi, if I remember correctly. And I didn't realize there was such old growth forests in Kansas. And EJ, are you familiar with that area? Have you been there? Or
So I think it probably would have been post oak and blackjack oak down in the Cross Timbers. So those are the old growth trees he was talking about that they sprouted in the 1700s. We do also have some old growth here in Northeast Kansas. Baldwin Woods is a really good example of that, and that Fort Leavenworth pecan at Fort Leavenworth. And yeah, those trees have been there, not sure exactly how long, but pushing a couple hundred years at this point. So I have not been to the Fort Leavenworth pecan or the Cross Timbers yet. They're definitely on my list. But yeah, in the Cross Timbers specifically, those trees are from the 1700s, a lot of them, very old trees. And I loved in that book too, he mentioned that his guess or a lot of people's guess as to why they were called Cross Timbers is because they were really hard to get through on pretty not ideal conditions. So that's why they were kind of left alone and not disturbed, not cut down, because it was so inaccessible. And they called it the Cross Timbers because if you wanted to use it, you were just crossing it. You were not messing with it. You were just trying to get across. So my other hypothesis is that post oak has cross-shaped leaves, but who knows?
A question, the Baldwin Forest, is that near Baldwin, Kansas?
Yes, it is. Mhm.
Okay, I'm not familiar with it, so that's what kind of surprised me. And also I might add in closing that I did email the author of the book and told him that I'd like to go down to the Cross Timbers area and look at that. And he mentioned it'd been quite a while since he'd been down there, and said if anybody ever goes down there, please take photographs, and particularly the old pecan trees. He wanted to be more updated on that, so just throw that out.
Great. Yeah, if you're looking to go that trail that he goes to, I think it's called the Ancient Trees Trail. I've heard really great things, so that's going to be my top spot to go in the Cross Timbers at least. But we can definitely send him an update on the Fort Leavenworth pecan.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Dan, I'm so glad that you brought up those pecans. I'm going to put a link in the chat, which is the champion tree page. That is where our state champion is for those pecans. But for those of you that are looking for kind of some of these cool areas, definitely check out that champion tree list. Just like everything else, most of them are on private land. And so that makes it difficult, but several are in parks and accessible places. So that can be kind of cool. I think the Fort Leavenworth pecans, probably one of the coolest champion trees we have in Kansas. But I imagine there are some others on there as well. So thanks, Dan, for bringing that up.
EJ, I want to thank you for recommending this book. It was super fun. So I'm Ryan Rastock out here. I actually grew up in Lawrence, lived here most of my life, a few wayward stints in graduate school in Arkansas, Montana, stuff like that. I've pretty much been in Lawrence forever. But what I thought was really cool about this book was reading about the stuff I saw unfold in real time with the Baker wetlands, right? Like, so the stuff that I was actually following through time. And so he had published that, and then having just kind of seen the area locally around Lawrence, you know, that he kind of published, and there was kind of cool to see in a book. As I don't know, but that for me kind of resonated pretty hardcore. So I spent a lot of time in the Caw and all of those areas and stuff like that, in the Baker wetland. So it was really cool to see that, you know, especially when he's talking about the otters. I remember all of that happening. So
Yeah, he does a really good job at laying out the drama of all of these conservation stories.
I love when things come full circle, and I like to get books on places when I travel. And I recently traveled up to the Pacific Northwest and bought a book on otters while I was up there. And so when he said the otter chapter, I was like, I'm an otter expert. I read this whole, but it is, I mean, it's such a fascinating species because they're so elusive, and also sea otters are huge. They can be like 6 feet long, which I had no idea. But to find out, you know, I thought I had to go to this exotic place to experience such cool wildlife, and truly it's in our backyard. So I thought that was really neat.
Yeah. Has anybody on this call seen an otter in Kansas? I'm just curious. Ryan has? Cool. Where at?
I've seen them well at Baker Wetlands, but then also I've seen them on the Caw before as well. So, but I used to spend a lot of time out there. So this would have been fairly recently, like well after he was documenting this stuff and everything.
Very cool.
I'd like to throw this out since it is a small group. I don't know that I would with a larger group. There are walk-in hunting areas and walk-in fishing areas throughout the state of Kansas. And while the intent is maybe not to get us that are conservation minded or anything, but are good people and respect, you know, boundaries, I have taken advantage of the walk-in fishing areas to explore areas that private land. These landowners understand that, you know, the public goes out there and uses their land for those purposes, and the walk-in hunting areas. I haven't used those quite as much, and you would want to be pretty careful, especially during rifle season, deer or something like that. You can check in as a hunter, but I don't know all the ins and outs. But anyway, I'd just like to throw that out there, that there some of these private lands might be available through those. This is not me suggesting that, this is not me saying that you should. This is just, maybe I have a friend that did, and it worked out pretty well. And as long as you respect the the law, and don't push it. I think that's a fair thing for us to do as good people.
I appreciate that, Mark. I thought it was really interesting just learning more about all the restrictions, especially on the chapter on water, and how restricted that is. One of the questions that I had for the group was, what do you think about the idea of turning our waterways into a form of e-commerce? Is that the right balance of incentivizing for the landowners, allowing them to opt in and make some money, while also making some of these spaces more accessible to Kansans or potentially to even more tourism? Or is that just a recipe for beer cans on our nice waterways? What do you guys think?
I'd say the canoeing drama in that book was pretty surprising to me. Like, I didn't really realize, like, I knew it was challenging in private land, but I didn't realize it was such a drama. It was very, very interesting to me in terms of canoeing the waters or accessing some of those areas. Clearly, having grown up here, I was aware of it, but not the logistics as of to how dramatic that whole thing kind of unfolded over time, which I find very interesting. And I was actually talking to Ryan Armbruster today when we were down in Wichita, and he was saying he got rid of he used to canoe a bunch in Nebraska when the open water is there, and then when he moved to Kansas, he just got rid of all that because there's just not as much access. So I don't know if anybody has thoughts on that.
That's kind of along those lines of just going from state to state. I was recently I was back in Garden City the last couple of days and attended a talk by Hannes Zacharias, who used to be the county administrator for Johnson County, also was a city manager for both Hayes and Lawrence at different times. But that's not what he was talking about. He was there because he had kayaked the entire length of the Arkansas River from Tennessee Pass in Colorado all the way down to New Orleans. And then he talks about the history of the river and things, but he touches a little bit on the politics of all that too. Is like, you think he's like, I was so glad to get out of Colorado and into Kansas. I guess the only unfortunate part is that part of that river is dry in Kansas, but the reason why he was saying that is because in Colorado, what you would think would be, I guess, probably in people's minds, that they think that they'd be more open with their, with their water rights and stuff like that. But he was like, that's not the case at all. Like, that the water itself was public in the river, but the bottom of the river is private property and both sides of the bank are private property. So he's like, if I was in the water, I wasn't trespassing, but if my paddle touched the bottom, technically I was trespassing. And he was like, when you get to Kansas, at least it's a navigable river, you're allowed to be there. But now George always talks about, he talks a little bit about obviously what's a navigable river and what is not, and how he tries to go through and get the permission from every single person is just absolutely wild that he actually accomplished that. And it's pretty interesting stuff, but it's unfortunate, like you're saying, just all of our neighbors have different rules on all this stuff. And like in Nebraska, they were obviously more lax with that. And then he gets here and he's like, well, this would be fun, but I can't do it. But it's obviously unfolding all over the place. I know it's unfolding in New Mexico. I think they ruled on people being allowed to keep most of the waters public. So kind of interesting stuff.
The buck drives our world, certainly our country. So that would be interesting to attempt to open it up to commercialization, on a small scale, but to get the contiguous, to get all the landowners to, for specifically for navigating down these creeks, maybe more for fishing purposes or things like that, it might be a little bit easier. There is another resource that I thought I'd throw out there. They're not paying me anything, but maybe I should call them and ask them too. It's called HipCamp, HIPCAMP. It's a website. They're the Airbnb of campsites. And so I've stayed on 2, and I'm getting ready to go up to Nebraska to stay at a 3rd place. And so individual landowners will open up their land for exploration and things like that. The last one I did was in Ellis County, north of Hayes. Amazing countryside up there. But you can't access any of it except by eyesight. So And that included a part of a river, and the place I'm going up in Nebraska is also a river, a bigger one. So that is another resource for us that want to get out into the land. Now, in this case, you're paying for it and, you know, are going to be camping, but I would like to see a little bit more commercialization of a little bit opening up in whatever form that takes. You know, if you got to pay a guy $10 to go fish on his part of the river or something, well, if you like to fish, maybe that's worth it. I don't know, but that's my thoughts on it. So.
That's awesome, Mark. I love all these resources you're sharing. That's super helpful.
And
Yeah,
oh, I'm sorry, real
no, go
quick.
ahead.
If you want to see pictures of sea otters, I have some on my website, which I'm not pushing it. But Mark Clark photos, and then you'll find a California portfolio or gallery, sorry. And they are in Morro Bay, and we were within, you know, a few feet of them for a day. So also
That's
elephant seals.
awesome.
Elephant seals also. They're not as
Nice.
cute, but they're massive. So yeah.
Anybody that knows me knows I'm 100% open to animal photos all the time. So I so appreciate that website reference.
Well, please check out other ones too. I'm not much of a critter photographer, but I have a few. It's hard to resist. So.
EJ, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I thought that this chapter in particular did a really good job of demonstrating that a lot of private landowners are super receptive and even excited to have people on their property. And, you know, 1 out of every 20 or whatnot is very much not, and you have to be aware of that. But again, as you all mentioned, really appreciated seeing that. I think 12 out of the 13 landowners he contacted were so down to let him float. And then the one was like, I better not see you there. So I think that there are some really great opportunities to, you know, engage with private landowners who would love to have you out. And I go out on private land all the time for my job. And I'd say like maybe 8 out of 10 times they're like, you can come back anytime you want, just let me know. So people are, you know, very open to that. You just have to be careful about how you're going about it and making sure you're being respectful, because we want to encourage that. And if there are people who are dumping beer cans in the river or whatnot, that's gonna paint a bad picture for the rest of us who want to access these spaces.
Absolutely.
I don't want to dominate the discussion here, but
No, you're okay.
I'm thinking of more resources. The Kansas Land Trust, which you've mentioned, they have public walks. I'm going to go on the Buck Creek for the second time Saturday. That's over here in eastern Kansas, and connect with them. I don't know what their need is, but they're also looking for people that will go out onto their protected lands once a year by agreement. They have somebody come out and check out the protected lands. And I'm actually hooking up with them tomorrow to get trained on that. So I can do that maybe once every 2 months or so. So I might get whatever, 6 or 8 in a year. Gives you another opportunity to explore private land with full cooperation of the landowner, because it's part of their contract. And I assume you can kind of be out there all day. So I'm hoping to. So that's another very good resource, which again, I know that you mentioned, but I thought I'd throw that in, that they are looking potentially for more help to do that.
Yeah, that's awesome. They are a great organization.
I don't know if any of them are on here now, but next week there is a meet and greet for the Kansas Land Trust at Sunflower Bike Shop, I think on Tuesday in Lawrence. So you may check that out.
Yeah, they have a new director. It'll be exciting. Well, kind of along those lines, right before I got to the chapter, I had a colleague mention the Buffalo Commons idea, but he couldn't remember the name. And so then I got to it. I was like, oh, Mark, you have to read this chapter. You know, this is the thing that you were saying, because for him, he remembers the time that this idea came around and the person that proposed it just got laughed, you know, out of suggesting it. But their research on how populated some of the parts of our state are is that it's not. there was some data at a conference I went to several years ago that said, by census standards, Kansas is going to be considered wilderness very soon. I think it was before 2050. So what do you all think about this idea that either as those areas are becoming less populated, or even now, as we start to see that trend, the government buys up land, creates some sort of national park or space that people could inhabit? But for those of us that are Kansans, that would also mean being neighbors with bison, maybe some bears, maybe wolves and cougars, which we probably are already neighbors with cougars. But what do you all think about, first, that idea of government buying up land to make this big refuge? And then also, what does that mean for those of us that still live here?
I feel like the government would have to get on it a lot faster before corporations do, which, they're already in the process of doing that for energy development. And the idea that there would be, I don't know, I love the idea, but the idea that the government, the federal government, with the timelines that they typically have on most projects, would be able to jump up and bring that above market value to buy up large tracts of Western Kansas seems farcical to me, but it'd be really cool,
Yeah.
I think you would have to probably, I mean, that's already been sort of proposed a little bit with like the 30 by 30 plan, which wasn't even the government taking. I mean, there's a lot of misnomers about that, but there was no idea of like the government seizing land. It'd be like an opt-in program like CRP is already. People are, maybe rightfully so, whatever, skeptical of stuff like that happening. But it's almost like private and public partnerships would be better suited and probably could go down that route. Like the Nature Conservancy getting, the state park in the Little Jerusalem Badlands was a huge win. And they're just such a great organization that, is able to, you have to like really go around a lot of politics and a lot of different people's feelings on that stuff. And they do a really great job of doing that. The American Prairie Reserve, that's actually kind of this idea that's already taking course in, Wyoming, Montana, up in that area. You're going to have to you would have to get probably already private owners that if they pass away or they're already wanting to like move stuff over. But I think it would be fantastic, especially for a Western Kansan like me. I would rather have something like that than a bunch of energy development out here, or like Andrew's saying, or another beef packing plant or whatever it is. And I think it would be a boom for an economy, because there's people that want to see some of these places. Little Jerusalem's one of those places, like Lake Scott's one of those places. If a Rickery Breaks was a public place, there'd be tons of people that would go up to a very sparsely populated area of the state. It could really be an economic wheelhouse for the state, as well as preserving some semblance of some kind of wildlife out here.
Yeah, I totally agree on on what you said. Yeah, and Rickery Breaks, that is there's just nobody up there. They run cattle and bison up there, but it's hard to find them because that place is so big, and they don't necessarily need all of that space to run all those bison and cattle on. They could spare a little bit for the traveler. So yeah, I totally agree with everything you said, that it'd be good to, economically for these areas, but also just to show people that there's stuff worth protecting as well. So
I think that's a huge pro for the book overall. It's just that we have things to be conserved, and even the other direction, we have things we've lost that we could try to reintroduce. Fantastic. Well, this is probably my last question, but EJ and I talked about it. It's like a little bit touchy, and there's probably not a right answer, but I feel like George kind of touches on it throughout the book, which is who is the steward, who should be the steward of the land? Is it the landowner? Should I as a Kansan get to make decisions that affect, land that I don't own? Is it the government? I mean, who who is going to come in and do some of these things that I think most of us agree should be done or could be done? Is there an answer to that question?
I feel like that question's way bigger than Kansas, right? And like just kind of speaks to the urban-rural divide that we've always dealt with in such a massive country like the United States, where the vast amount of the populace is in the city and might not really have as much familiarity with the lives and livelihoods of people in the country that actually own the land, or they live in the city and they do own much larger tracts of land in more rural places where they don't live, which, as Kansans, especially folks that are in natural resources, dealing with those absentee landowners that don't actually live on and work the land is its own bag of tricks, right? And just a huge question that you bring up there. That was a super helpful answer, I know.
Yeah,
Good question
that was a perfect
there, Ariel.
summary.
Yeah.
Well, I think that the part about the prairie dogs and the landowner that wanted to rewild his land, and then the county came in, and that certainly answers the question that there isn't an answer, at least not an easily accessible answer, because there are so many conflicting interests. So the notion of getting a larger area to rewild might be kind of the only way to do that, and unfortunately leaving it up to individuals, counties, or the state or the federal government. Not everybody wins in that situation, of course, and a lot of the times it's the wildlife and the natural resources that lose. But anyway, so there's no answer. Every answer given is a good answer and a really horrible answer, and that's just proven in this book with those prairie dogs, and now the black-footed ferrets, and potentially more bison on public land, and
Yeah, that chapter in particular, the black-footed ferret chapter, it just made that picture really messy, right? Because it was private landowners butting up against another private landowner. That private landowner wanted those ferrets there. That is his property, right? He's making his own decisions to manage that land. But then all the other private landowners around them were like, hey, that's going to affect my private land. So I want to go on your private land and kill things on your land. And the whole idea of like, they were shuffling cattle around because it was illegal for them to poison the prairie dogs while there was cattle grazing there. It just really made a really messy picture of all of that, which is reality. But I thought that was a really interesting case where even private landowner objectives are not going to align. And where do you draw the line of this is my land, this is your land, this is all of our land? Very complicated.
I always think it's interesting because it's probably a little easy to be like, private is, bad, public good or whatever, but there's such a mixture of all of that because it all depends on either private or public, the people behind it. There could be good intentions behind a public policy that then gets the wrong person in there and exploits that. Or like you said, there's a lot of fantastic private owners that do very well on their land and want to have the best intentions. I don't know if there's obviously isn't an answer to, the either government or private being over our wildlife or lands, but I kind of feel like at least a little bit that the government has a little bit of a moral obligation to, because they were also kind of the ones that pushed for so much destruction for so many decades. We're kind of riding a very wrong ship, and we're trying to do that in the last maybe 100 years or so. But prior to that, it's the U.S. government that pushed a lot of these policies that kind of have completely transformed our state's landscape. So I think that there's a little bit of that. I feel like a moral obligation of paying for those sins maybe a little bit, but that's my own opinion. So
makes you wonder what we're going to think about our current policies in 100 years, right? Oh man, we definitely have it figured out now, though, for sure. Yeah,
Totally. Yeah, I'm glad we got everything right, you know, everything.
yeah. I don't know about you guys, but I've got it figured out.
Yeah.
The government definitely does, yeah.
And it'll be nice, you know, if the internet continues to be a thing, this discussion will live on and people can laugh at us and how dumb we were for all our, for eternity.
Yeah, as a historian, you know, you loved it like when you read stuff and you go like, how dumb were these people? But I'm like, what thing are we doing like that people are gonna be like, I can't believe that they did whatever, drank out of plastic, probably. Like, don't they know that that gives you something like whatever it is? But
Not that long ago, the US Forest Service was recommending everybody plant honeysuckle in their backyard. Yeah.
I was just listening to a podcast on a guy that does the Montezuma apple tree restoration project, something like that out in Colorado. And he was talking also, he's like, yeah, you know, we had all these different varieties that grew out here and they were fantastic. And, you know, there's always like heritage apples, and who told them to cut them down because they didn't need that many was a land grant college in Colorado. It was the extension service that said, you know, you don't really need all those. And now like him and his wife work on, you know, finding those varieties again. So even when we think we're being experts, doesn't always mean that that isn't going to just turn a 180.
Circle. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I was at an event today. I don't know. I won't say where, but I think you know where I'm getting, Ariel, is I was at an event
EJ and I
today
had this talk. I'm still upset.
where they were still advocating planting calorie pair. So you know, we're still dealing with this stuff today, and we'll be dealing with it tomorrow, next day.
Yeah, I think this is all a good point too, kind of tying into our last discussion point about who should be making these decisions. And I think everybody wins when those decisions are diversified and we're listening to a lot of voices. We're not listening to one source, pulling a lot of information from different places, you know, and talking about who should be in charge of this land too, and diversifying voices, but learning from Indigenous folks. And I think George did a really good example in this book of putting that knowledge front and center, because oftentimes the people who are best informed to make these decisions and to hopefully know how their outcomes are going to be decades down the line are people who have been living here and seeing it on the landscape.
Absolutely. Well, I will leave just a little bit of space for any final thoughts before we wrap up today.
I would say that if anyone's interested with the library here, we did a book club in January. So if anyone hasn't read Timothy Egan's The Worst Hard Time, about the Dust Bowl, which it was like a National Book Award winner and or Pulitzer, one of those big awards. It's an actually, he does a great job writing. He's a really good writer, but it just kind of talks a little bit of, kind of touches on some of that stuff, especially out here in the plains and or even further south from here. But, you know, government policy, native policy, who owns land, who manages land, all that stuff. It's a really, really good book. And, you know, you can make the parallels probably a little bit of, if we're making some of those same mistakes on things, or what have we gotten better at? So
I just found that book for 50 cents at the Lawrence Public Library sale. I'm very excited.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book and really should be read by quite a few people. And the bonus thing is, just like with George's, the writing is really like engaging.
Yeah, his personality came through a lot in his reading.
Yeah.
It's fantastic. Well, I am going to throw our follow-up survey in the chat. You all, I'm going to send it out when I send out the recording for people that didn't join us, but you all that joined us, I'm especially interested in your feedback because you're here. Your opinion matters more. Does the time work? Is the topic good? Did you like it? Did you hate it? Do you want us to do something different? I'm open to all of that. And I will read the comments before I send it out with the recording for those that were not able to join. So you guys, your comments get like top priorities. You should feel super special. I super appreciate everybody that's joined us, everybody that's able to watch the recording. Thank you so much for your time. We are probably going to skip book club a little bit during the summer just because we're all busy being outside And then my intention is to pick it up again in the fall. So if you have book recommendations, send those along as well. Thank you guys for being on today.
Thanks for having it. See you guys later.